It was the middle of the 19th century. Two German philosophers living in England were trying to formulate an ideology that would rock the world. The first time they revealed their ideas was in the Communist Manifesto, which had been published some time before. One of these two philosophers was Karl Heinrich Marx, the other Friedrich Engels. These two believed in a philosophy known as materialism. Which claims that nothing exists apart from matter. Actually, materialism was an ancient dogma which had been put forward by the Greek thinker Democritus. During the French Revolution, however, a number of European thinkers took materialism back off the shelf, dusted it off, and began to propagate it again. Their aim was to do away with religious beliefs, and materialism was the only philosophy they could put up against religion. While supporting materialism on the one hand, Marx and Engels turned to a method known as dialectics, which claimed that conflict was the basic law of nature. For that reason, their theories came to be called dialectical materialism. Dialectics was a hypothesis maintaining that all development in the universe comes about as a result of conflict. The two philosophers attempted to interpret the history of the world in terms of dialectical materialism. Marx wrote books on history and economics, attempting to make these conform to that dogma, and Engels did the same for science and philosophy. Furthermore, Marx tried to see into the future. In his view, the industrialized nations of Europe would shortly undergo bloody revolutions as a result of the dialectical principle of conflict. The working class, oppressed by the capitalists, would rise up and seize power, after which a communist system would be established. The concepts of religion, morality, and the family would have no place in this communist society. Marx and Engels were faced with a major difficulty, however. They viewed human history through the lens of dialectical materialism, even if they had to distort that history in the process. But what about natural history? How had living things come into existence? There simply had to be a materialistic answer to that important question. That answer was provided by another ideologue, again living in England at the time. As the Royal Navy vessel, the Beagle, crossed the Atlantic Ocean on its voyage of discovery, it carried a young researcher on board, Charles Robert Darwin. After the long voyage on that ship, he returned to London in 1836. He spent the rest of his life trying to formulate a theory to explain how living things came into being. Darwin unveiled his theory in The Origin of Species, published in 1859. In it, he maintained that living things came into being in just the same way that materialist philosophy claimed. In other words, by a series of coincidences. What is more, he proposed that these coincidences work by means of conflict, as dialectic. In short, Darwin adopted nature to dialectical materialism. Darwin's theory had no scientific foundation. That is why prominent scientists of the time refused to take him seriously. apart from two people, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Just 1 month after the publication of The Origin of Species on December 12, 1859, Engels began a letter to Marx with the words, "Darwin, whom I am just now reading, is splendid." A letter from Marx to Engels shared the same excitement. These last few weeks I have read all sorts of things, among others, Darwin's book of natural selection. This is the book which contains the basis in natural history for our view. The relationship between Darwinism and Marxism grew even stronger. Marxists adopted the theory of evolution as their own scientific foundation. These duly spread under the influence of Darwinism. The books of Marx and Darwin appeared together in communist posters of the time. The Franco-Prussian War of 1871 allowed for the first experiment in the revolution Marx had dreamed of. France was defeated and the imperial administration overthrown, leaving a power vacuum. The Marxists seized their opportunity. Together with other small socialist groups, they provoked an uprising in the capital, Paris, and established a commune, an administration based on communist principles. Under the new regime, Paris turned into a city of terror. Churches and government buildings were torn apart. Men of religion were shot by the communards. The streets were filled with barricades. The Commune was finally suppressed by government troops that entered Paris after lengthy fighting. The first experiment in communism had left 18,000 dead behind it. Yet how was it that Karl Marx's theories were able to spread so quickly? The answer to that question was provided by the famous German scientist Rudolf Virchow. At a congress of naturalists, Virchow took the floor to warn those biologists who supported Darwinism. Be careful of this theory, for this theory is very nearly related to the theory that caused so much dread in our neighboring country. Virchow was right. Darwin's theory of evolution was of great importance in the spread of Marxism among Western intellectuals. The theory portrayed human beings as a species of animal, claimed that they would develop by means of conflict, and most important of all, denied the idea of creation. These three great errors formed the basis of Marxism. The first of the communist revolutions built on that foundation was to take place in Russia. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was ruled by the Tsarist regime. However, revolutionary communist ideas were beginning to spread among an increasing number of workers. Part of the military apparatus had also come under the ideology's influence. The leader of the communist movement in Russia was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. The communist movement led by Lenin was known as the Bolsheviks. These believed that bloody revolution would be necessary for them to seize power. Despite the fact that they had been illegally organizing for years, they had been unable to achieve their aim. The opportunity they were looking for came in 1914 with the outbreak of the First World War. That war was the bloodiest conflict that mankind had ever known. One of the countries involved in that war, which cost the lives of 10 million people, was Russia. The Russians suffered defeat after defeat in the first 3 years of fighting and lost 2 million dead. The suffering inflicted by the war dragged Russia towards revolution. In February 1917, army units in the capital, Petrograd, rebelled and took over the city. Tsar Nicholas II, who was at the front encouraging his troops, set out for the city. His train was stopped by revolutionary troops, however, and the Tsar was arrested. All symbols of the Tsarist regime were destroyed by revolutionary soldiers. Supporters of the revolution rejoiced in the streets. Most people hoped that the end of the Tsarist regime would bring happier times for Russia. But they were wrong. The Bolshevik contribution to the February 1917 revolution was actually quite minimal. They were poorly represented in the post-revolutionary parliament that was set up. The government passed into the hands of the pro-Western Kerensky, a Democrat. Lenin, then in exile, ordered his men to give the new government absolutely no support. He continued to organize the Bolsheviks for his own revolution. And in October 1917, he struck. Lenin's armed militants attacked the Winter Palace, the center of government. They killed those guards who resisted and carried out one of the easiest coups in history. Soviet propaganda films made years after the event would portray the coup as a huge popular uprising started by Lenin's fiery speeches. The fact was, though, that the number of people who attacked the palace was less than 100, and only 5 people died. Lenin started with a silent coup. Yet things were not to remain so. The Bolsheviks attacked those army units still loyal to the Tsar. A terrible civil war began that would last for 3 long years. The Bolsheviks established the Red Army to prosecute that war. Lenin's right-hand man, Leon Trotsky, was placed at its head. Red Army units and the secret police agencies set up by Lenin, known as the Cheka, had no compunction about using the most ruthless methods to deal with monarchists and other anti-communist groups. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and 5 children were executed by order of Lenin. Those cities which refused to support the Bolshevik regime were ruined. In telegrams to his militants, Lenin ordered that all those who opposed the communist regime should be shot. The Bolsheviks arrested tens of thousands of people for the crime of opposing the regime. Most of these were tortured and executed en masse. The famous Russian writer Maxim Gorky described examples of Bolshevik savagery. In Tambov province, communists were nailed with railway spikes by their left hand and left foot to trees a meter above the soil, and they watched the torments of these deliberately, oddly crucified people. They would open a prisoner's belly, take out the small intestine, and nailing it to a tree or telegraph pole, they drove the man around the tree with blows, watching the intestine unwinding through the wound. Stripping a captured officer naked, they tore strips of skin from his shoulders in the form of shoulder straps. A terrible fear fell over Russia, but the communist savagery had only just begun. When the Bolsheviks came to power, most of the population of Russia lived in the villages, enjoying a pretty miserable standard of living. Most peasants were only just able to feed their families with what they produced. The freezing Russian winters made productive agriculture an impossibility. A decision taken by Lenin in 1918 inflicted an even worse disaster on millions of peasants who were already living in poverty. Private property was forbidden, and the peasants' goods were to be confiscated by the state. Lenin carried out that policy by means of another right-hand man, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the head of the Cheka, well known for his ruthlessness. Cheka officers descended on villages all over Russia and began rounding up peasants' crops and livestock at gunpoint. A quota to be handed over by every peasant and given to the Bolsheviks was drawn up. In order to meet that quota, most of them had to give up all that they possessed. Peasants who protested were silenced by the most savage means. On 14 February 1922, one inspector who visited the Omsk region wrote, "Abuses of position by the requisitioning detachments, frankly speaking, have now reached unbelievable levels. Systematically, the peasants who are arrested are all locked up in big, unheated barns. They are then whipped and threatened with execution. Those who have not filled the whole of their quota are bound and forced to run naked all along the main street of the village and then locked up in another unheated hangar. Lenin was enraged when he realized that the quota set for the villages would not be met. In 1920, he inflicted a fearful punishment on some regions that had resisted the requisitions. Not only would these peasants' crops be seized, but also all the seeds they possessed. Confiscating the seeds meant that the peasants would be unable to produce a new crop. In other words, they would have nothing to eat. Then the famine began. 29 million people within the borders of Russia battled with starvation. In 1921 and 1922, 5 million starved agonizingly to death. Lenin watched what was happening with enormous pleasure. In his view, the famine was most useful. He calculated that it would help to destroy people's belief in God and religion, and make them bow their heads to communism. In the Black Book of Communism that sent shockwaves around the world, that devilish idea of Lenin's is discussed thus. As one of his friends later recalled, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov had the courage to come out and say openly that famine would have numerous positive results. Famine, he explained, would bring about the next stage more rapidly and usher in socialism, the stage that necessarily followed capitalism. Famine would also destroy faith not only in the Tsar, but in God too. This is what Lenin wrote to the members of the Politburo on March 19, 1922. The present moment favors us. With the help of all those starving people who are starting to eat each other, who are dying by the millions, and whose bodies litter the roadside all over the country, it is now and only now that we can and therefore must confiscate all church property with all the ruthless energy we can muster. Our only hope is the despair engendered in the masses by the famine, which will cause them to look at us in a favorable light, or, at the very least, with indifference. These communications in the Soviet archives have revealed that Lenin deliberately brought about that dreadful famine which cost 5 million lives. That is the same conclusion arrived at by the historian Richard Pipes, who spent years researching the archives in his book, The Unknown Lenin. In his view, for humankind at large, Lenin had nothing but scorn. Individual human beings held for Lenin almost no interest, and he treated the working class much as a metal worker treated iron ore. The reason why Lenin and the other Bolsheviks were so utterly ruthless was the dialectical materialist philosophy they so believed in. This philosophy regarded human beings as a kind of animal and maintained that violence and conflict were necessary for the development of mankind. Not only did Lenin regard human beings as a species of animal, he also employed animal methods to train them. In October 1919, he paid a personal visit to the Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov, famous for his conditioned reflex experiments on animals. Lenin wanted to impose these conditioned reflex methods on the whole of Russian society. Pavlov was astounded. "I want the masses of Russia to follow a communistic pattern of thinking and reacting," Lenin explained. Pavlov was astounded. It seemed that Lenin wanted him to do for humans what he had already done for dogs. Do you mean that you would like to standardize the population of Russia? Make them all behave in the same way, he asked. Exactly, replied Lenin. Man can be corrected. Man can be made what we want him to be. The so-called scientific basis for that philosophy that regarded human beings as a species of animal was Darwin's theory of evolution. The theory of evolution was the most important ideological inspiration behind the communist movement in Russia. Darwin's The Origin of Species was translated into Russian at the end of the 19th century and was responsible for thousands of young Russians turning to atheism and communism. Russian communism was so tied to Darwinism that Georgy Valentinovich Plekhanov, widely regarded as the founder of the movement, clearly stated that he regarded Marxism as Darwinism in its application to social science. Plekhanov's student, Lenin, indeed applied Darwinism to society and mercilessly slaughtered whole societies he regarded as herds of animals. The truth is that human beings are not a species of animal, but are honorable beings created by God in possession of a soul. The reason for their existence on earth is not, as communists and Darwinists would assert, conflict, war, and bloodshed, but for them to display a morality that is pleasing to God. Only when man has understood this concept, in other words, only when he lives by true religion, will he find peace and happiness. The end of Lenin, who denied that fact, is a terrible warning. From 1922 on, an increasingly serious sickness slowly began to paralyze him. He spent most of 1923 in a wheelchair, suffering from terrible headaches. In March 1923, he had a stroke and was thenceforth unable to speak normally. In the final months of his life, those who saw Lenin were terrified. His face had taken on a peculiar expression, and he was half mad. The final photograph taken of him shortly before his death was utterly ghastly. God speaks of the fate of such cruel people in the Quran. Then the final fate of those who did evil will be the worst because they denied God's signs and mocked at them. Lenin died on January 21, 1924. The Bolsheviks organized a huge funeral ceremony for Lenin. The leaders of the Communist Party decided to have his body, which had a tremendous importance for them, embalmed. Among those bearing Lenin's coffin was the next dictator of Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin. Stalin would rule Soviet Russia for nearly 30 years and establish a regime of such bloodshed and terror that would even surpass that of Lenin. All the historical facts we have so far considered have an important moral for mankind. False ideas can lead to disasters for people and societies. Communism is one such false idea, and it inflicted dreadful suffering on the world during the 20th century. One of the fundamental errors of communism is that it believes conflict to be an unchanging law of nature. The so-called scientific justification for this view is found in the theory of evolution, which says that the differences between people necessarily lead to war, fighting, and conflict. According to this view, called dialectics, every class, every nation, and every society is obliged to fight every other one, and this is a law of nature. That view stamped its mark all over the 20th century, and is the common inspiration behind both the communist savagery we have seen in this film, and also behind that of fascism, which appears to be the complete opposite of communism. It is only possible for mankind to escape this cycle of violence by coming to know the purpose behind his existence. Human beings are not a species of animal that emerged by chance and live only to fight, as Darwinists, communists, and fascists believe. Human beings are noble beings, created by God, and possessing His soul. And the purpose of man is to learn and to live by that pleasing morality that God has taught him. In the next section, we shall continue to examine the disasters that communist ideology, which rejects that truth, has inflicted on humanity. The Bloody History of Communism, Part 2. Stalin's regime of fear, death camps, and secret murders. The Soviet-Russian genocide of Muslims. Stalin's scientists killed for refusing to accept the theory of evolution. Do not miss The Bloody History of Communism, Part 2. In the first part of this film, we examined the birth and development of communist ideology. As we have seen, no matter how much they promised they would bring peace and justice to the world, Marx and Engels' theory actually brought only blood and death. Taking Darwin's theory of evolution as its so-called scientific basis, communist ideology spread rapidly, witnessing its first revolution in Russia. After taking power, Lenin, who led the revolution, set up a dictatorship and spread terror over the length and breadth of Russia. Today we know that Lenin had not the slightest feeling of compassion for his enemies, and that he had tens of thousands of opponents of the regime tortured to death or shot. Furthermore, we also know that the famine caused by his mistaken policies led to the deaths of 5 million innocent people. These facts, confirmed by the archives, reveal the bloody history of communism to all. The bloodiest pages of that bloody history, however, were written by another dictator, a man who left even Lenin in the shade. The dictator was Stalin, one of the worst murderers in history. In this part of the film, we shall be seeing the murders committed by Stalin's regime, together with the dimensions of the disasters that Darwinism has visited on the world. Stalin came to power on the death of Lenin and ruled the Soviet Union by fear and torture for nearly the next 30 years. During that time, he was responsible for some 40 million deaths. Stalin spent his first years in power consolidating his position. He managed to sideline Trotsky, whom he perceived as his major rival, and later had him arrested and exiled. In 1929, Stalin implemented a policy known as collectivization. Lenin's experiment in nationalizing the land had remained half-finished, and Russian peasants were still working their own land and selling their own produce in the market. By means of collectivization, Stalin meant to complete Lenin's initiative and to take away all the peasants' lands and produce in the name of the state. Collectivization began with propaganda films. Posing on tractors, Stalin played the role of a leader who would lead Soviet agriculture towards a new dawn. Russian peasants were shown celebrating communism in front of posters of Karl Marx, and even dancing with happiness. Yet the truth was very different. In 1930, peasants' produce began to be collected up. The Red Army, one by one, seized the produce from every single field. Some peasants managed to hide their goods rather than give them up. But Communist Party officials searched every nook and cranny, eventually discovering the hiding places. The officials also seized the peasants' agricultural equipment. The peasants were left with nothing to eat and nothing to work the soil with. Eventually, that catastrophe that Lenin had described as the most useful for communism raised its head again: famine. In Ukraine alone, 6 million people starved over the next few years. 2 million died in Kazakhstan, and 1 million in northern Caucasus. Children reduced to skin and bone died in agony. There was another ghastly result of the famine inspired by Stalin: cannibalism. Peasants maddened by hunger began to eat corpses. Then an even worse horror emerged. Some peasants had kidnapped children and eaten them. In front of these 2 Russian peasants, caught eating human flesh, lay the remains of the children they had snatched. Stalin's regime had turned human beings into savage animals, just as communism had intended. Everyone who opposed Stalin's collectivization policy paid with his life. The principal target were the landowners known as kulaks. Posters denigrating the kulaks were put up everywhere. Tens of thousands of kulaks were detained and shot. In actual fact, the regime branded everyone it saw as opposed to its ideology as kulaks. Large numbers of priests and even members of their congregations who attended church frequently were arrested as kulaks. Some were executed. Others were sent to the labor camps, where a slow, lingering death awaited them. These camps were set up all over Russia and were simply another of Stalin's killing machines. Millions of people regarded as enemies of the state were worked to death in them, under the most terrible conditions. Some were put to work laboring on canals in the blazing heat. Others were sent off to break rocks in the freezing cold of Siberia. These people, forced to perform hard labor under the worst possible conditions, soon turned into living skeletons. The great majority never left the camps alive. Joseph Stalin was delighted by all this. In a speech to the Communist Party Congress in 1934, he declared collectivization to be a great success and was warmly applauded by the delegates. One by one, Stalin's closest associates took the floor and declared what a genius he was. However, a secret vote at the end of the Congress produced an entirely unexpected result. Out of the 1,900 delegates, 300 voted against Stalin. Stalin was stunned. The ballot forms were immediately collected and burned, and the vote declared invalid. It was then announced that Stalin had been unanimously elected Secretary General of the Communist Party. This was not the end of the matter, however. Stalin decided that that treachery would not go unpunished. About 1,000 of the 1,900 delegates were killed within a few months by Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. Stalin had Sergei Kirov, a popular figure who got a larger ovation than Stalin at the Congress, assassinated. He then staged a huge funeral ceremony in his memory. Stalin walked behind the coffin of the man he himself had murdered. Dozens of people linked to Kirov were disposed of by the NKVD over the next few weeks. Many officials at the most senior levels of the state were killed by order of Stalin during the 1930s. Some were made to undergo show trials, duly found guilty of all charges, and executed. It was necessary to be a loyal sycophant to survive by Stalin's side. Stalin had many able people disposed of, out of a fear they might emerge as rivals to him. Some of these were army generals. In 1938 and 39, the most prominent generals in the Soviet army were either killed by the secret police or condemned to death at rigged trials. This unbelievable policy of dissemination on Stalin's part meant the country was defenseless in the face of Nazi aggression. Nazi Germany indeed took advantage of the opportunity thus presented to it and invaded Russia on June 22, 1941. German units advanced hundreds of kilometers within a few weeks, burning and destroying everywhere they passed through. Stalin had ignored intelligence reports warning of the likelihood of invasion, and accused those commanders who forwarded those communications to him of cowardice. As a result, the Nazi menace that Stalin had regarded as unimportant eventually forced the Soviet Union into the bloodiest war in history. "25 million Soviet citizens would lose their lives in the war between 1941 and 1945. However, the number of Soviet citizens killed by Stalin was even higher than that of the number killed by the Nazis. Between 1937 and 1938 alone, 7 million people were detained for political offenses, of whom 1 million were killed. The number of people killed throughout Stalin's regime would eventually reach 40 million. Stalin forced millions of people living under his regime from their homelands by means of internal exile orders issued in a single night. People were crammed into trains and sent off to the dark lands of Siberia.
Allahu Ekber, Allahu Ekber, Allahu Ekber,
Stalin implemented a particularly cruel policy against the Muslim people living in the Caucasus and the Crimea. In one night, May 18, 1944, 400,000 Muslim Tartars living in the Crimea were rounded up from their towns and villages and sent to labor camps in the most distant corners of the Soviet Union. More than half of these were to die before they ever reached their destinations. Mounted NKVD units sent to Muslim villages slaughtered tens of thousands of Muslim women, children, and the elderly included. Behind them were left thousands of deserted Muslim villages. The traces of some of Stalin's terrible slaughter have come to the light of day in our own time. An NKVD mass grave containing 30,000 bodies was found in the vicinity of the city of Minsk. Some of the bones bore torture marks, and there were bullet holes in most of the skulls. This is what communism brought to the world. While the communist system was killing millions, it also terrorized those whom it left alive. Communism was literally a regime of terror. It regarded society as a collection of animals that needed to be managed, and believed that the only way to do that was by fear and terror. Stalin would be applauded for minutes on end at Communist Party congresses. The reason for that was because everyone there was terrified of being the first to stop. Stalin had already killed a number of delegates who had failed to demonstrate the necessary enthusiasm. The Communist Party organized frequent rallies to protest against so-called traitors and agents. Anyone could be a target of that campaign. People earlier regarded as exemplary communists could later appear pictured in the columns of Pravda like savage dogs. Everyone was terrified the same thing might happen to them. One favored tool of the Reign of Terror was mass executions. Thousands of people were publicly executed during Stalin's reign. Communism's reign of terror also dealt a heavy blow to the arts. Pre-communist Russian society had enjoyed a rich culture with great writers, painters, and composers. Yet with the advent of communism, ugliness and crudity came to dominate Russian art. The new style was known as socialist realism and locked all Russia within narrow, lifeless constraints. The frozen nature of communist art is a result of the materialist philosophy that constitutes its worldview. Materialist philosophy regards human beings as simply a collection of matter, and is a simplistic belief that seeks to reduce everything to the same matter. The application of this to art ended in a complete fiasco, as it did in all other spheres. True art is an expression of wonder at the aesthetic and other delights given to man by God. In order for art to develop, it is necessary for that yearning in the soul that comes from creation to be freely expressed. In communist dictatorships, however, that atmosphere of freedom was completely eliminated, and art died as people came under constant pressure. Another blow dealt to society came in the field of science. During Stalin's time, all the scientists in the country were forced to sign oaths of loyalty to dialectical materialism. All scientific research was twisted to agree with materialist dogma. The theory of evolution enjoyed a special place among those dogmas so fiercely defended by Stalin. The Soviet dictator's devotion to the theory went right back to his youth. Stalin had been brought up in a religious household and had been religiously educated in a church school. Yet just as he was preparing to become a priest, he read a summary of Darwin's Origin of Species, and his life suddenly changed. Stalin was easily deceived by the superficial claims of Darwinism and became an atheist. In that state of ignorance, he promptly joined the ranks of the Bolsheviks. The theory of evolution again formed Stalin's most important source of inspiration when he came to power many years later. He was especially keen that the theory should be taught in Soviet schools, and declared the intention behind that. There are three things that we do to disabuse the minds of our seminary students. We had to teach them the age of the Earth, the geologic origin, and Darwin's teachings. One of the most striking indications of Stalin's dogmatic attachment to the theory of evolution was the Trofim Lysenko affair. Trofim Lysenko was a young agricultural expert in the 1930s. He had an interesting idea. He rejected the Mendelian genetics that had been accepted by the scientific community since the early 20th century and supported instead the idea that living things evolve and acquire their characteristics from the environment, originally proposed by Lamarck, a forerunner of Darwin. Stalin was impressed by Lysenko's nonsense and made him president of the Lenin All-Union Academy of Agricultural Sciences. The years that followed saw the preparation of an agricultural program in the light of Lysenko's idea of evolution, and it was forcibly imposed on villages by party officials. Lysenko believed that if seeds to be sown were kept for a long time in cold water, they would evolve according to their chilly environment. In order to test that idea, tons of seeds were kept in cold water and then sown in the steppes of Siberia. They were all ruined, of course. Lysenko's theory dragged Soviet agriculture back by decades. Yet Stalin continued to support Lysenko up until his death. Stalin was so slavishly attached to Lysenko's theory of evolution that he had no hesitation over having those scientists who rejected it killed. One of these was the world-renowned Russian geneticist Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov. Vavilov was arrested one night by order of Stalin. He was photographed like a criminal and sent to the labor camps on the grounds of planning to sabotage Soviet agriculture. He died in one of those camps in 1943. Other Russian scientists who believed in Mendelian genetics, such as Muralov, Levitt, and Levin, were taken from their homes by members of the Secret Service in the middle of the night. Most were executed. Stalin, who carried out all this savagery in the name of materialist philosophy and communist ideology, died in 1953. According to a KGB report revealed in 1991, he had had 42 million people killed during his regime. Stalin's cold and arrogant features were a reflection of the dark world of communism itself. God describes the position of such cruel rulers in the Quran. Whenever he holds the upper hand, He goes about the earth corrupting it, destroying people's crops and breeding stock. God does not love corruption. When he is told to have fear for God, he is seized by pride which drives him to wrongdoing. Hell will be enough for him. What an evil resting place. The Red Terror in the Soviet Union continued after the death of Stalin. The new Soviet leaders partially moderated the regime at home, but exported communist savagery abroad. The Hungarian bid for new independence from Moscow that began in 1956 was bloodily suppressed by Red Army tanks. The streets of Budapest were filled with corpses. Another resistance movement in Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1968 was again ruthlessly put down by the Red Army. Then the Red Army invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Before the invasion, Afghan communists had staged a revolution in the country with Soviet support and staged mass killings of religious figures there. The Red Army entered the country in order to increase the scale of the slaughter. In the 10 years that followed, Soviet units rained death down on the Muslim Afghan people. Afghan villages were ruthlessly bombed by Soviet planes and helicopters, and Red Army units inflicted the most barbaric tortures on Muslims. One child whose family were all killed by Soviet troops described the communist savagery.
They shot my father 3 times, in his chest, his shoulder, and the back of his neck. He fell down dead. My brother and his commander got very angry and fought back. My brother jumped up and grabbed one of their weapons. More Russians came and cut all my brother's fingers off with a bayonet. So of course he was helpless. After his fingers had been cut off, they beat him. They shot him in one ear and the bullet came out the other.
5 million Afghan civilians fled the savagery, becoming refugees. They sought refuge in neighboring countries such as Pakistan and spent years living in dreadful conditions in makeshift tents. Despite all its military might, however, Soviet Russia failed to overcome the Afghan resistance. The Red Army was forced to leave the country in 1988. The Soviet tanks left hundreds of thousands of innocent people dead behind them, and once again demonstrated the suffering inflicted on humanity by the ideology known as communism. The historical facts we have so far seen demonstrate that although communism emerged surrounded by fine slogans about justice and equality, it really brought humanity nothing but blood and death. Communist ideologues and dictators such as Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin are responsible for the deaths of some 50 million people. Communism literally turned the world into a slaughterhouse. Another ideologue who must share part of that responsibility is Charles Darwin, the man, in other words, who built the basis in natural history for the communist view, as Karl Marx put it. As they staged bloody revolutions, committed ruthless massacres and waged their wars, communists were actually bringing Darwin's theory to life. That was a theory that regarded human beings as a species of animal, that believed that conflict and fighting were an unchanging law of nature, and that, most important of all, encouraged people to deny God, their Creator. That is why it will only be possible for mankind to be freed from communism and other bloody ideologies when the Darwinian deception is done away with. When mankind is woken from the spell of Darwinism and materialist philosophy, it will come to know its Creator, God, and will live by the morality He teaches. In fact, God tells us that we have to follow only His way. This is my path, and it is straight, so follow it. Do not follow other ways, or you will become cut off from His way. That is what He instructs you to do, so that hopefully you may do your duty.